This is the history of James Berry and Myrtle Steelman Hargrove from 1911 to 1930. I never heard how Jim Hargrove and Myrtle Steelman met, but it was told that there used to be gatherings for young people in the homes of the more affluent families in the Hazel Green community. These social events would feature a musician of some sort, someone who could play a guitar, banjo, or fiddle, and they would play so that folks could dance. Jim and Myrtle would attend these parties and became quite fond of each other. Jim could not dance, so in order to pacify Myrtle and to keep her from dancing with the other young men of the community, he would hold hands with her and walk around out on the dance floor. I guess that's where all of us menfolk in this family get all of our grace and charm. Apparently, the relationship progressed somehow, and the couple decided to get married and bought a marriage license on October the 26th, 1911. In the early morning of October 29th, 1911, Myrtle got up early long before daylight and quietly came downstairs where the only mirror was in the bedroom of her parents, and with only the light from the fireplace, dressed and fixed her hair. When she finished, she went back upstairs to gather her few personal belongings. Her father, George Steelman, suspected that something was up, so when he arose, he went upstairs to talk with her. The upstairs was just one big room with a chimney right in the middle, which came from the fireplaces downstairs. When she heard him coming up, she hid behind the chimney, and he assumed that she was gone. He went back down to the kitchen where his wife Priscilla was starting to cook breakfast. Myrtle sneaked back downstairs and outside before she could be discovered. I never heard why she thought that it was necessary to elope. Maybe it was because she was pretty young to be getting married at that time. She was only 17 and Jim was only 19. As she was leaving, she heard her father telling her mother that they had lost their cook. Jim was still asleep when she arrived at his house. His mother, Sarah, went to his bedside and told him that Myrtle was there to see him. He seemed to think that was funny, that she would come for him, and he chuckled as he arose from the bed. Many times in later life, he would embarrass his wife by telling that story. After having breakfast, the two of them set off to be married. They went to the home of a local coroner or squire who had the authority to perform marriages, and they inquired of him. They were told by his wife that he was out back feeding the hogs. So they proceeded to the hog lot. After he was located, he married them right there next to the hog lot. Wasn't that romantic? I guess they weren't too big on ceremonies. Jim and Myrtle went to Huntsville, where his older sister, V, was also living at a boarding house and moved into a rented room with her. She was working at one of the cotton mills at the time and was able to help them both get a job there. They were country folks and had never been around this many people, for the cotton mill was a large facility. Also, the place where they lived was bubbling over with people, for there were boarding houses all around to service the large number of workers employed there. There was no age restriction for employment, and if a parent or guardian signed a permission form, minors could work there. There's a list of minors in the Madison County Archives with a 13-year-old Hargrove child working there. Days were long and nights short because many of the people who boarded there stayed up late and made quite a bit of noise into the night. Jim and Myrtle were a bit uneasy about living in such an environment, and it didn't take long for them to figure out that they wanted to return to country life and a more quiet lifestyle. One night, which was particularly noisy, they were a bit afraid until finally Jim told Myrtle to wake V up. I don't know what good he thought that would do, but she got up and went over to V's bed and leaned right down over him and began to call her by name. When V woke up, she could only see a silhouette of Myrtle above her, and it scared her to death. Now there were 3 people who couldn't sleep. It's not long how long they stayed in Huntsville and worked at the cotton mill, but family records show that their oldest son, Hassie, was born in Huntsville on the 11th of August, 1913, just 12 days before his grandfather Steelman died. Myrtle's father, George Steelman, was a good, hard-working man. Her mother, Priscilla, had been partially crippled since she was a young child. Because of her condition, she was limited on how much she could do. As long as George was alive, he worked hard and provided well for the family. However, George became ill shortly after Myrtle and Jim married with what they believed was cancer. One day he was out working with his team in the fields, but he came home early in the afternoon, which was uncharacteristic of him. He took the harnesses off the team and turned them loose in the pasture. He walked to the house and sat down in the doorway with his feet down on the step, for the house didn't have a front porch. He told Priscilla that he wasn't feeling well and he laid back on the floor. She went outside and cut a limb off a peach tree and came back and sat by him and kept the flies brushed away with the limb. As she sat there by him, she got the distinct feeling that he would never be well again. He became increasingly worse and died about 3 weeks later at the age of 48 on the 23rd of August, 1913. His death left the family with still some young children and a handicapped mother in dire circumstances. Without an able leader, the family was forced to scavenge around and live a scanty life. Much of the time, they were there in the home of Jim and Myrtle and would eat everything in sight, as if they were afraid it would be their last meal. Jim never complained, but it was a financial burden on him and his family to have all the extra mouths to feed. Estelle said that he did it without uttering a word because of the great respect that he had for his father-in-law. Next, Odell was born on the Elk River near Prospect, Tennessee, where they lived, and worked a farm owned by Ed Hargrove, who was Jim's uncle. It was while they lived here, there was a large spring that formed a small pond over some quicksand. The location of this quicksand was made known to Jim, so he was careful to keep the livestock penned up in the pasture, which kept them out of the spring. The livestock were led to the spring on a leash when it was time for them to drink, so that they didn't wander off into the quicksand. On one occasion, one of the mules broke out of his pasture and went to the spring to drink. When he got there, he waded into the quicksand and got his front leg stuck. Jim tried for a long time to get him out with no luck, but finally rigged up a long pole somehow and tied a rope around him and lifted him up. When his legs were finally forced free, he made a huge lunge backwards onto solid ground. He never made another attempt to walk off into the spring. Apparently from there, they moved back to Madison County in the Hazel Green community, where Sallie and Otis were born. We don't know much about that period of time. Jim didn't like to stay in one place very long, so the family moved around quite a bit, as you will see as time goes on. Jim's youngest sister, Molly, married a man by the name of Newman Hicks. Newman bought an 80-acre farm somewhere prior to 1920, and on the 13th of October, 1920, he sold Jim and Myrtle 20 acres of that land with a 5-room house on it for $750. Newman still owed $165 to Mr. W.J. Stewart, and Jim assumed that balance as part of the $750 that he paid for the farm. The mortgage has a notation written along the left side saying that the mortgage was paid in full and satisfied on the 13th of August, 1921, with N.L. Hicks name at the end. This farm was located in northern Madison County, Alabama, on a stretch of road called Borderline Road, which ran in between Alabama and Lincoln County, Tennessee, and lay in between Reeves Road and St. Clair Road, which both ran north and south in Madison County. In the spring of 1921, Jim bought a pair of mules from Os Hargrove and began to farm his own land. Estelle was born there, and Sally says that she can remember a neighbor lady by the name of Miss Sterling. Sometimes in the winter of 1922-23, the house that they owned and lived in burned down. There was a notation in the tax records in the Heritage Room on the 3rd floor of the Huntsville Library that the house burned. Since they didn't have a house anymore, Jim went out in search for a place for them to live. Apparently, he left the land to the care of Newman Hicks, since 20 acres wasn't enough land to make much of a living, especially with no home there in which to live. Shortly after that, they moved to Limestone County and rented a farm which had a grist mill and a country store on the Ragsdale Creek on Warren Usery's place east of Pettusville. Apparently, it had been his parents' farm and house, and his mother had lived there before the Hargrove family moved into it. Warren Usery had been a normal poor farmer who lived near Ragsdale Creek until one day when he was plowing some new ground up on a hill. As he plowed near a stump, he hit a large pot of gold that was buried there, and he became instantly rich. Because of this stroke of luck, he now had a fortune to buy up land and houses, rent them out, and make deals with sharecroppers to work his land. This house that Jim and Myrtle moved into was located near a road, which made it convenient for residents of the community to stop by and trade. The local folks would bring their corn to the mill and have it ground so that they could make cornbread. It would be measured out in a scuttle and then poured into the hopper for grinding. The same scuttle which was used to measure the corn was placed below the mill to catch the meal. Whole corn was sort of heavy and would pack down on its own, but the meal was light and fluffy, so that after it was ground, the scuttle would be full of meal before all of the corn was used. The corn that was left was given as payment for the grinding, and when enough was accumulated, it was later ground, sacked up, and sold to other customers. The mill was built right on Ragsdale Creek, and there was a long race that was built out of wood which ran from a spring that came out of a hill above the mill. The water ran down the race and poured off the spout at the lower end onto a big water wheel, which was turned by the force of the water. At the center of the water wheel was a large shaft that ran through one of the outside walls to the mill inside, which ground the corn. Many times the Hargrove children would climb inside the water wheel and walk as the wheel turned just for fun. The mill was inside a country store where Jim and Myrtle sold many of the essentials to the local country people. Jim and Myrtle came to be known as Papa and Mama, and this is how they'll be referred to on this story from now on. Soda pop was kept outside in the creek to keep it cool, And this was a great temptation for the children, for they weren't allowed to drink up the profits. Once Odell got the idea that she would open every one of those bottles and take a drink out of each one of them, and Papa would not be the wiser. This she did, but hadn't stopped to figure out how she would get the top seal back on the bottles, especially since they were now bent. Her deed was discovered, and Papa was quite upset and said that he would rather that she opened one and drank it all than open every one, which kept them from being sold to potential customers. When Hassie was young, his speech was really slow and drawn out. Once he and Odell were having a conversation, and he asked her if she remembered when Papa and Mama got married. She replied, "Well, I sure do. I was standing in the back of the buggy." Estelle was only 2 when they moved to Ragsdale Creek, and she was quite high-strung. When things didn't go her way, she would lie down on the floor and kick her feet really fast and cry very loud. One day, Papa came home during one of these mad fits, and he wasn't in a mood for that, so he took off his hat and whipped her with it. That brought about a change in her attitude. The store and mill did not have a steady stream of customers, so Mama would take care of the chores in the house until someone came up to buy something or to have corn ground. Then she would go out to the store and take care of their needs. When they left, she would return to the house. Papa was busy most of the time working the farm. It was while they lived here that Papa got pneumonia and became so ill that he could not work. His fever got really high, and he was in a coma for a while and almost died. Calvin Hargrove, one of Uncle Tom's sons, came over and plowed and chopped the crops during this period of sickness. Later, John, William, and Sarah, Papa's parents, moved over there to help out and lived in a small house nearby on the farm. John worked for Papa and was paid wages and given goods from the store to compensate him for his labors. Estelle was very fond of her grandparents and would beg to go back home with them every time they came to visit, and since they only lived a few 100 feet away, she was given permission quite often. Grandma would send her out to the woodpile to gather chips to build a fire for cooking. Chips were small pieces of wood and bark that would fly off the sticks of wood as they were being split or chopped in two. Grandma would tell her to only get the chips and not dirt. Estelle would go out and hold up the front of her dress with one hand and pick up chips along with the dirt and put them into the pouch with the other. Then she would go back into the house and dump all the chips and dirt onto the floor by the stove. Grandma would never complain. She would just pick up the chips and put them into the stove. Then get the broom and sweep up the dirt and throw it back outside. Grandma Hargrove was a very religious woman, and almost every time that Estelle came to visit, she would take her out to a grove of trees near their house and kneel down and pray. It was during these experiences that Estelle learned how to pray to God. Later on, as an adult, when she heard the story of Joseph Smith going to the grove to pray to the Lord for guidance, she immediately believed his story because it was so familiar to the experience that she had had as a child with her grandma. One Christmas season, while they lived on the creek, someone broke into the store and stole a bunch of stuff, including all the soda pop that Papa had to sell. According to Sally, he had a pretty good idea who did it, but had no proof and never called the sheriff. Papa always made sure that the kids had some kind of present for Christmas. Most of the time it wasn't much, but each of the children had something that they could open on Christmas morning. Oftentimes, Farmer would leave scraps in the field and not gather them. If anyone came along who wanted to pick it, they would give what was left to the willing party. After the store was robbed, money was tight, and Papa went about asking some of the farmers in the area if he could have their scraps. Some of them consented, so he left the kids with his parents and he and Mama went out and pulled bowls to make some Christmas money. At the end of each day, they would bring the cotton home and store it in a stall in the barn until they had enough for a full bale. One day when they came home and put up their cotton, Mama decided that she wanted to go visit her mother. So Papa got all the kids loaded up and off they went. After supper, Jink, George, and a friend who were visiting said they had somewhere to go and they left the house. They were out very late and Papa was worried. The next morning when they woke up, Papa was ready to go home. He got everyone up and left before breakfast. When he got home, he went straight to the stable and the cotton was all gone. He went down to the gin at Elkmont and talked with the ginner. He described 3 young men who brought the cotton in, and it matched Jink, George, and their friend. The ginner made Papa a copy of the receipt that he had made out for the cotton. Papa went back to Mammy Steelman's and told her what had happened. But she defended her boys and would not believe that they had done it. While he was there, he found out who the other boy was and where he lived. He then went and talked to the boy's father and told him what happened. The man told Papa that if he wouldn't call the law, that he would pay him the value of the cotton. Papa consented, and the man paid him right then and there. The family had a dog that was bitten by some other animal and got rabies. When Papa discovered it, he sent Sally to warn Grandpa and Grandma Hargrove to stay inside the house and keep the door shut until he could take care of the dog. As Sally was returning home, the dog was out in the yard and began to growl at her, and she was afraid. She was near the garden, which was fenced with a woven wire to keep animals out. So Papa hollered to tell her to climb over into the garden. She did that, and once she was in the garden, she wasn't afraid anymore. Papa got his shotgun, walked out onto the porch, and shot the dog. One of the customers who came regularly to the store was a man by the name of Rufus Crabtree. He was a nice man and would usually buy some candy and give it to the Hargrove children. So all of them made a point to go to the store when they saw that he was there. Some of the neighbors that lived nearby had some ducks. The ducks wouldn't stay at home but would travel up and down the creek for long distances. They would lay eggs in or near the water all over, and the owners wouldn't bother to go and search for them. So the general rule was that wherever the eggs were laid became the property of those who lived on the land that bordered that part of the creek. The Hargrove children were constantly wandering up and down the creek looking for duck eggs. When they were found, they would bring them home to Mama, who would place them in the nest beneath the setting hen to hatch. The soft down feathers were frequently picked from the ducks and used as stuffing for pillows. Lucille was born while they lived there. Papa's sister V was married to a man named Jim Anderson, and they had one child, Sallie Lou. At a fairly young age, V got tuberculosis, and after a while could not take care of her chores and care for their daughter. Jim had to work the farm by himself and had little time to take care of V, so he would go around and visit family for a few weeks at a time so that they could help take care of her and the daughter. Sallie Lou was about the age of Estelle and Otis and would play with Estelle a lot. She invented a game where she made a nest out of a quilt or something, and Estelle was the setting hen. When Sallie Lou would come to the nest to get eggs, Estelle would flog her the same way a setting hen does on the nest. Aunt V thought that was so funny. Aunt V died in 1926 at the age of 36. Later, her husband remarried, but his new wife didn't like Sallie Lou, so she went to live with Aunt Florence in Huntsville. Her father, Jim Anderson, owned and paid for his farm and the home, and later when he died, his new wife got everything, and Sallie Lou got nothing. Nobody knows if the burglary at the store left a bad taste in Papa's mouth, or if it was just an itch to move, but after 2 years, they moved across Ragsdale Creek to another farm that was owned by Warren Nursery. When that happened, Grandpa and Grandma Hargrove had to move too because there was not a house for them at the new place. Ollie and Tennie, Papa's younger brother and Mama's younger sister, were married and lived nearby on Elijah Ray's farm. The house that they lived in was large, so the grandparents moved in the house with them, and each couple lived on opposite ends of the house. Ollie was young and didn't have much money to buy teams and farm equipment, so he sharecropped using Mr. Ray's implements and teams to work his crop. Later on, Grandpa and Grandma Hargrove moved back to Hazel Green, where he was able to sharecrop on a large farm owned by the Lowe family. They were well satisfied there and lived there as long as they were in good health and age permitted. The Lowes were a very wealthy family that owned large tracts of land in Madison and Limestone counties. They owned a huge cattle farm which bordered the research farm where I grew up on the Mooresville Road. They also may have owned one of the cotton mills in Huntsville. The new home was not near the road, but it was located with the creek right in the front yard. There was a cave nearby with a spring close to the entrance, and that is where they got water for drinking and cooking. Mama would send the older kids to the cave to wash off the rocks where the water ran down so the water would be clean to use. Ragsdale Creek had several small waterfalls, and quite a bit of it had solid limestone slabs on the bottom. At one place there was a whirlpool, which probably fed down into an underground stream. The kids got a large wash tub and carried it down to the creek where the whirlpool was, then got in the tub and were spinning round and round in the water. None of them could swim, and when Mama saw them, they were in big trouble. They got the whipping of their life. Papa managed to buy a Ford sedan during this time, so Mama decided that she would learn to drive. Papa gave a few brief instructions and off she went. Most of the kids piled on or in somewhere, some in the back seat and others standing on the running boards while hanging on. Apparently her driving lesson was a little too brief because she ran over the gate post and knocked it down, then ran into the woodpile before the engine choked down and died. She climbed out of the car and vowed that she would never drive again, which she never did as far as we know. One day it was coming a thunderstorm and Papa wanted the mules to come to the barn so that he could fasten them up. For some reason, horses and mules seemed to attract lightning. He stood on the porch and whistled for them for a while, but they didn't come. He had gotten a shepherd dog since the other one went mad, so he called the dog and sent him down after the mules. Shepherd dogs have a natural instinct to herd livestock and bring them back home. As the dog would nip at the heels of the mules, Blue just steadily came toward the barn, but Dick resisted the dog and would kick at him and turn on him constantly. It took him a while to get there, but the dog was persistent and carried out his job. While they were there, Hassie made a toy water wheel out of a baking powder can and a board. When he put it into the current of the creek, it would turn just like the wheel of a mill. Velma was born here in the fall of 1926, and the house that they lived in was right on the Alabama-Tennessee state line. Papa was serious when it came to working, but he also liked to have fun. Back in those days, there wasn't much in the way of entertainment. Papa had joined the Baptist church, and he had tended to favor that church. The Steelmans, however, were Pentecostal, or as they were commonly called in those days, Holy Rollers. Papa loved to go to their meetings. To him, that was entertainment. He got quite a kick out of watching them in their attempt to get the Holy Ghost. After they succeeded, it was like they were in a hyper kind of trance. They would be jumping around and shouting and speaking in unknown tongues. Some of them would handle snakes. To really prove that you had the Spirit, you needed to handle a poisonous snake. The eastern diamondback rattlesnake that is found in this region reaches about 6.5 feet long and can weigh over 10 pounds. The menfolk would go into the hills and hollers and catch these big rattlesnakes and put them in a lard stand and take them to wherever they were having the meetings. Mama's older brother, John Steelman, was one who belonged to the Pentecostal church. John married a widow by the name of Ada Pope, who had several children. Her son, Wilson, was about the age of John's younger brother, George Steelman. One day, Wilson and George went and caught a big rattlesnake and had it in a lard stand. That night, George dreamed that the snake bit his brother John, and he died. This scared George, and he told Wilson that he was going to turn that snake loose. Wilson protested that he had helped catch that snake, and he was not going to turn it loose. The following evening at one of the meetings, John attempted to handle the snake, and it bit him on the hand. This scared George so bad that he ran home immediately and was waiting word that John had died. John didn't die, but the infection was so bad that he lost one of his fingers. Many people did die from being bitten by those snakes back then. Tom and Lacey Pettus were a couple that lived nearby in the Pettusville community. They had the job of delivering the mail, and they did so in a buggy pulled by one horse. The horse was so well trained that every time he came to a mailbox, he would get over close to it and stop when the buggy got even with it. After the mail was placed in the box, Mr. Pettus would make a clucking sound with his tongue, and the horse would take off again. If there was a long distance between houses, he would get into a slow trot. In the wintertime, Tom had a large round limestone that he would put into the fireplace and leave it overnight. In the morning, he would pull it out with a poker and slide it off the hearth into a burlap sack. Then he put the sack in the bottom of the buggy and covered it up with their legs and feet with a couple of quilts, and that is how they would stay warm while delivering the mail. The Hargrove children enjoyed watching for the mail carrier. Papa started trading at a country store in Pettusville owned by Van Head. Van was an old bachelor who lived next door to the store in the house with his mama. He had some dolls in the store that were very pretty. The body of the doll was made like a rag doll, but both hands, feet, and head were made of porcelain. If you bought $10 worth of goods at his store in one trip, he would sell you one of those dolls for $1. Papa had bought 2 of them for his younger girls, Estelle and Lucille, and Estelle and Lucille thought that they were the prettiest dolls they had ever seen. Papa and Rufus Crabtree had become good friends, and he and his family would come to visit from time to time. One day, Mrs. Crabtree came to visit and brought their 2 boys who were about 4 and 5 years old along with their baby. These boys got the 2 dolls and threw them up really hard, and they hit the ceiling and broke the porcelain all to pieces. Estelle cried when she saw what had happened to them. The family moved from there in the winter of 1926-27. The next residence was on the Pettus place in Pettusville. This farm belonged to Stout Pettus's daddy, Thomas Pettus. Stout Pettus was my principal for the first 10 years that I went to school. This place had been cleared at one time, but had started to grow up in locust trees, which were just young saplings at this time. Papa had the kids go out into the field to clear it once again using axes, picks, and grubbing hoes. Mattie Pettus, the oldest girl in the family, would come down and visit with them as they would work, and she heard Sally sing. She would go up to Sally and take whatever tools Sally was working with and take her place clearing so that Sally could stand on a stump and sing for her. Her younger brothers, Stout and Bennon, would come to visit too and play with Hassie and Otis. There was a school at Pettusville, and this was the first opportunity that the Hargrove children had to go to school. The Pettus family was really big on education, and they were probably responsible for the school being there. All of the ones that were old enough went to school. There was a red-haired, freckle-faced boy by the name of Buren Martin, who was quite mischievous, who went to school there. One day, as the children were going outside for recess, he pulled Estelle's hair and then ran away. She ran after him and caught him when he had to slow down to open the door to go outside. She kicked him square in the seat of the pants before he could make it out the door. 2 or 3 teachers were standing nearby and saw the whole thing. They thought that it was pretty funny. This boy was murdered in 1945 when he was just 24 years old. He was buried at the cemetery there in Pettusville, but they wouldn't let him be buried inside the fence with everyone else. Folks around there said he was so mean that they buried him on the outside of the fence. While the family lived there, Riles Steelman, Mama's younger brother, would come and stay with them and work for Papa. He liked to tease Otis. Otis was a good-looking kid and really likable, and he always took teasing well. One evening while they were sitting around talking, Riles had been teasing Otis, and he decided that it was time to get even. He said, "Uncle Riles, I'm your daddy and your boss, and you ain't got no money." Everyone busted out laughing, including Riles. After that, Otis was called by his nickname, Dad. Whenever all the crop was gathered, Papa would take the family up to his Uncle Ed's to help him pick his cotton and get paid by the pound. Papa would be out there picking with everybody else, and he didn't allow anyone to stop. Estelle would pick as fast as she could and get ahead. Of course, she was only picking 1 row, and Papa was picking 2. The reason to get ahead was because Uncle Buddy would plant watermelons all in his cotton fields. She loved watermelons, and when she would come to one, she would stop and bust it open and eat the heart out of it. On one of these occasions, while she was in the process of eating watermelon, Papa picked up a piece of a small stump and threw it at her. It hit the ground nearby and splattered dirt all over her watermelon. Then he told her to get back to work. Mama never worked while she was having babies and taking care of them. She stayed at home and took care of the little ones, cleaned house and cooked the meals. When one of the kids became old enough to work, Papa would take them to the field or to the woods and teach them how to work, and he made sure that they did everything the right way. Later on, when they were older, he would give them instructions on what jobs to do, and they already knew how to do it because they had been taught, and he didn't have to be there to oversee them. Mama never worked into the fields until the youngest child was old enough to go out and work. Papa took care of her too. When he was going to town and she wanted something, he always came back with it. The kids might not get anything, but Mama would. She would get a treat. Papa didn't believe in spoiling the children with too many luxuries, so he would buy a pencil for 2 kids, and they would have to cut it in half and share. Otis and Estelle split one, and Otis got the end with the eraser, which did not make Estelle very happy. Otis and Estelle only got to go to school for about 3 weeks and they were taken out. Papa thought hard work was a lot more important than schooling. The older kids, Hassie Odell and Sallie, got to go most of the time for about 3 years when they weren't needed to chop or pick cotton. Papa was pretty good at trading and making a profit. If someone came along who wanted to buy something that he had, he would sell it to him for the right price. Sometimes he had a car or a truck, but if someone came along and wanted to buy it, he would quote them a price and quite often would sell it on the spot. The family remained on the Pettus farm for a couple of years, which was about average for Papa, then located further south near Elkmont. The next move was to D. McClung's farm near Newmarket, just southeast of Elkmont. About the same time this move took place, Uncle Ollie and Aunt Tennie moved about a mile away on the Guthrie farm. Ollie was poor and didn't have much to work with, so he always was borrowing things from Papa. Shortly after they moved, Ollie borrowed Papa's crosscut saw, and Papa needed it. Saws and axes were tools that were needed year-round. Firewood was needed on a daily basis to fuel the wood cook stove, since electricity was not available to most folks at that time. Estelle was about 8 or 9, and Papa sent her to get the saw. In between where they lived and Uncle Ollie was one house, and the people who lived there had 3 big dogs that sounded pretty mean when someone walked by. These dogs scared Estelle, and she ran to get away from them. She made it to Ollie's, got the saw, and started back. Most people carry this type of saw on one shoulder, and it will hang down in the front and the back. When Estelle tried to do that, it would hit the ground while it bounced up and down as she walked. She decided that it would be better for her to hold to one handle and drag the saw. When it snagged on something, she dropped it and it cut her heel. As she came near the house with the dogs, she figured she wouldn't be able to run past the dogs while pulling the saw, so she took a detour into the cotton field to avoid them. The field was overgrown in cockleburrs, and they were higher than her head. She was getting them all over her as she tried to walk through the field. As luck would have it, Ollie decided shortly after she left that he would walk over and visit with Papa. He saw her when she turned into the field, so when he got to the place where she was, he beckoned her to come back and walk with him the rest of the way. She had begun to get a little panicky and was greatly relieved to see her uncle there waiting for her. He shielded her from the dogs, and they made it to the house without any further incident. Papa was very industrious and was always looking for ways to make more money to support the family, especially with having to feed the Steelmans most of the time. Back in those days, cars and trucks had quite a few parts that were made of wood. One of the things that was wooden were the spokes for the wheels. In downtown Elkmont, near the railroad depot, was a place that bought billets to make spokes for automobiles. A billet was a stick of wood 15 inches long and 2 inches square. The auto companies only wanted hickory, and that was in big supply in this country. During the winter months after the crops were all gathered, Papa and the children that were old enough to work would take saws and axes and go to the woods to cut hickory trees and chop them into billets. Because everyone depended on wood for cooking and heating water and cleaning and washing clothes and such, renters and sharecroppers were allowed to cut wood on the farms that they worked. Also, the landowners liked to have the trees cut because that was a means of getting more land cleared that could be used to plant crops and yield them more money. Papa and Ollie would cut down the trees with a crosscut saw and saw it up into 15-inch lengths, while Grandpa Hargrove would split them into 2-inch square sticks and all would load the wagon completely full to take down to Elkmont to sell at the depot. There were 2 girls hired to inspect the billets, and they would hand check every single one to make sure that they met the quality standards. They would not accept any that had knots or were twisted or gnarled. Every time he made a trip to deliver a load, there would be about a dozen or 2 that got rejected. Papa would just put them in the back of the wagon and disperse them among the next load, and eventually all would be taken. One day Papa was cutting trees up on a little hill, and the wagon was at the bottom of the hill. Hassie had his arms full of billets and was on his way down the hill to put them into the wagon. There was a patch of ice part of the way down the hill, and because his arms were full, he couldn't see where he was stepping, so he slipped and fell, throwing billets everywhere as he did. Grandpa Hargrove was coming behind him with a double armful, and he cried, "Hey, you little rascal, don't be dropping all that wood. We'll never get it loaded." Hassie was scurrying to pick up all the wood and to get it down to the wagon when about that time, Grandpa stepped on the same patch of ice and went down just like Hassie. He felt pretty foolish and had to apologize to Hassie for being so harsh. Grandpa would work all winter long for Papa for 50 cents a day. Hassie was pretty mature for his age. He was good with the livestock, and Papa put him in charge of them before he was in his teens. He did most of the plowing and cultivating. It did not have to be watched over. Papa would just tell him what needed to be done, and he took care of it. Papa had a wooden box that he took with him every place that they moved. He would nail it up on the barn somewhere, and it held a curry comb and a brush. Each evening, Hassie would take the harnesses off the mules, then curry and rub them down with the brush, and give them a good ration of corn or some kind of grain. He also took care of the cows and hogs. Times were hard, and everyone had to work together to survive. Odell, Sallie, and Estelle would sleep side by side in a double bed, while Lucille slept crossways at the foot. Hassie and Otis would sleep in a bed in either the living room or the kitchen, and the babies would sleep in the bed with Papa and Mama. When there were relatives staying over, which was the case almost every weekend, there might be 5 or 6 people sleeping in one bed, or several sleeping on the floor on pallets. Whenever Papa took cotton to the gin, he would have the ginner keep him out a sack full of cotton after the seeds had been removed, and he would take that back home. Mama had a couple of hand tools which she would take and card the cotton. This process would separate the strands of cotton and make it fluffy. She would then use this fluffy cotton as batting and make a couple of quilts each winter. Quilts came in mighty handy in those days because most of the houses weren't very well insulated, and it could get pretty cold at night. Sometimes the house only had the wall studs with the siding nailed up on the outside and no insulation or anything nailed to make the inside of the walls. Most of the time the siding was made of poplar because it would last a long time, and it wasn't even painted. There were times when they would wake up in the morning and there would be snow on top of the quilts where it had blown through the cracks in the walls during the night. There was a family who lived nearby by the name of Clem, and they had a son in his early 20s named Raymond. Raymond had a good friend by the name of Archie Green that spent a lot of time visiting their family. Raymond also had a younger sister, Clora, who was intent on going everywhere that these 2 young men went. One day they were on their way to visit friends, so they cut across the farm that Papa was working, and Clora was following them. They decided to run so that she wouldn't be able to follow them anymore. She was determined to go and was running after them, so they ran into Papa's cornfield to evade her. Mama was out in the cornfield picking corn, and Raymond wound up running down the same middle that she was in. When she looked up and saw him coming directly for her, she ran into the house as fast as she could and got Papa's shotgun. About the time that he came out of the field and into the yard, she was coming out of the house with the gun and threatened to shoot him. He talked as fast as he could, trying to explain to her that he meant her no harm, but was only trying to get away from his sister. She didn't buy anything that he said and continued to hold the gun on him. Hassie was out in the field next to the cornfield plowing, and he saw Cora running in the same field that he was in. When he saw his mama with a shotgun, he figured he had better go straighten things out. As he approached, Raymond told Hassie the story, and Hassie told Mama that he believed him because he had seen Cora out in the open field. Mama finally put down the gun, but she still wasn't happy about the situation and remained skeptical of his story. Papa always raised a field of sugar cane to make molasses out of. When the cane was ready in the fall, it would be cut off near the ground, stripped of its leaves, have the seed head cut off, and taken to where there was a molasses mill. When the stalk was cut, the root was still alive, and there would be leaves that would grow up around the short stub, and they would sometimes get about knee-high. After the first frost, these suckers, as they were called, would be poisonous. It was vital to keep the livestock from eating them. One evening, Otis was driving the team and wagon, and he opened the pasture gate to drive them inside, where he was going to unhitch the team and turn them loose. A heifer calf of Daisy, the Jersey milk cow, ran out through the gate and into the cane field and began to eat the leaves. Otis ran out there as fast as he could and drove her back into the pasture, then fastened the gate. Before long, she was bloated and laying down on her side and breathing hard. Papa and Otis were out there but didn't know what to do for her. About this time, a local man by the name of Mr. Carter drove up in his wagon, and Papa told him what had happened and asked if he knew what to do for her. He asked if he had a long neck bottle and some baking soda. He told him to pour the whole box of baking soda into the bottle and fill it up with water and shake it up really well. After it was mixed, they held the head of the calf up and forced the neck of the bottle into the calf's throat and poured the mixture into her stomach. Then Mr. Carter told Otis to get her tail and pull it up over her back and pull hard on it, then relax for a minute and keep doing that until she passed the gas that was building up in her stomach. He did this for a while, and the calf passed quite a bit of gas, and then they left her for the night. The next morning she seemed to be well. Most of the time when that happened, the animal would die. As I said before, Papa not only supported his own family, but also fed his mother-in-law along with most of her children, so by the time spring arrived, he was out of money. Each spring, he would have to borrow money to make a crop. Most of the time, he borrowed it from Warren Usery. So on March 19th of 1929, Papa signed a mortgage to Warren Usery for $200 and gave all his livestock and farm implements and tools as collateral. The mortgage was to be paid in full on or before November the 1st. That was the year of the Great Depression. During that year, prices began to drop, and by fall, everything hit rock bottom. There was a wealthy couple who lived in Elkmont by the name of Harry and Pam Morris, and they owned and ran one of the cotton gins there. Later, when Pam Morris was an old woman, she needed someone to stay full-time with her and to do the cooking and cleaning. Estelle took the job. Pam's husband, Harry, had died some years before, and she had no children. While Estelle was taking care of her, Pam told her an interesting story. She said that her husband Harry was a big Alabama football fan, and that he had traveled down to southern Louisiana to watch Alabama and LSU play a game. While he was down there, he called back to check on things and was talking to Pam on the phone at the gin office. He asked how things were going, and she replied that they were not so good, that the gin was full of local farmers with faces so long you needed a yardstick to measure them. He asked why, and she told him that cotton had dropped to 5 cents a pound that day. Then she laughed. Estelle sat there and listened to her story in total silence, but was thinking, my daddy was one of those men who was there with the long face. Harry and Pam didn't worry because they were quite wealthy, so they built 4 big warehouses in downtown Elkmont alongside the railroad tracks and bought up all the cotton that they could get their hands on and stored it in these warehouses. They waited until the price went back and sold this cheap cotton for 35 cents a pound, increasing their investments 7-fold. Later that day, Papa returned home and informed Mama that they were in trouble. With cotton at 5 cents per pound, there was no way that he could feed their family the coming winter. On the next pages are pictures of the warehouses that were built to store the cotton during the Depression until the price went back up so that they could be sold at 7 times the amount that they paid for it. These warehouses still stand today in downtown Elkmont alongside the old railroad bed. An older couple from England now own them and live next door. The day that I went to take these pictures, they were curious why I wanted them and wanted to know a little bit about the history of these warehouses. I told them how my grandfather had been forced to sell his cotton for 5 cents per pound, and it was stored there. Right before Pam Morris died, she was a bitter old woman with no children and resented her late husband's nephew and family, who would be inheriting her land and money. She made the remark that they were just waiting for her to die so that they could collect her fortune. All of her life she had lived very comfortably, much better than most, but even with all that money she was miserable and unhappy. Warren Usery was full aware of what was going on. Nevertheless, he and his wife would come by and pay Papa and Mama social visits on Sunday afternoons and make small talk and pretend that all was well. When November the 1st rolled around, he came back for another visit to collect his money. Papa had only gotten $100 for his share of the cotton, and he gave that to him and asked him if he could sell the Jersey milk cow that he had. Someone had offered him $150 for the cow, and that would give him enough to pay the mortgage. Warren refused, stating that the Jersey cow was part of the collateral on the mortgage. He put the $100 in his pocket, then went outside and loaded up all the farm equipment into the wagon, hitched up the 2 mules Dick and Blue to the wagon, tied the cultivator, the cow, and calf to the back of the wagon, and drove away, leaving Papa penniless and without any means of making a living. Estelle stood in the front door and watched him drive away, and she never forgot it. A copy of the original mortgage is here to see. On April the 10th, 1930, son was born, making a total of 8 children of his own that Papa was responsible to provide for, not to mention all the Steelmans that relied on him for the most of the meals that they ate. Food was pretty scarce around there before much time had passed. Mama didn't think that they could afford to take corn to the mill now, so she took a lid from a tin can, got a nail and a hammer, and went outside. She laid the nail on the chop block and punched holes in it with the hammer and nail. Then she got some corn and rubbed it back and forth across the side where the holes were sticking up, which ground the corn into meal, and she made cornbread. Papa and the boys hunted and brought home squirrels and rabbits and did whatever they could to survive. One day Hassie was walking up Hayes Mill Road, and he passed a pasture where Warren Usery had taken the two mules, Dick and Blue. They were far away in the backside of the pasture, but they spotted him. Immediately they began to bay and to run there to where he was. He walks over to the fence and waited for them. Then when they got there, he talked to them for a while and rubbed their noses. Eventually he had to go, and as he walked, they followed along beside him until the pasture ended, then stood there in the corner and nickered as long as they could see him. This made him sad, for he had been the one who worked with them most of the time, and he cried as he walked down the road. Losing everything upset Hassie as much as it did Papa and Mama. After Uncle Pitts died, Aunt Evie and her two children, Milton and Patrick, had no place to live. Milton was a little older than Otis, and Patrick just older than Estelle. Aunt Evie already had tuberculosis herself, and she couldn't take care of the boys. She and the boys would come and stay about a month at Papa's and then stay about a month at Aunt Florence's. None of the rest of the family would allow her to stay with them because they were all afraid of catching the disease. They would come by from time to time and visit, but would not touch her or eat or drink anything in the house. Papa and Mama's bed was in the living room, and they put a half bed near theirs for Evie. Papa and Mama were very cautious and took great pains to make sure that no one got infected. Evie had her own chair that she always sat in, and she had a separate chamber pot and a separate dishpan in which her dishes were washed. She would eat her meals there in her chair, which were brought to her on a tray and placed in her lap. She was not allowed to sit at the kitchen table and eat with the rest of the family. When each meal was finished, her dishes were collected and washed after the family dishes, and then were put into a big pot and boiled on the stove. The children were instructed to stay out of her face so that airborne germs could not be passed to them. Son was just a baby then, and she longed to hold him, but Papa would not allow it. Once she asked Mama if she could hold Son, so she put him in her lap, turned away from her face, and she held him until her son Milton told her that Papa was coming. Then Mama picked him up. When she would go back to Aunt Florence's house, her bed linens were stripped, washed, and boiled, and her bed and chair were taken outside the sun for several days. These precautions seemed harsh, but they kept everyone in the family from catching the deadly disease. Grandpa and Grandma Hargrove were getting up in age, so they left the farm where they had lived for some time and moved in with Florence in Huntsville. They were both in poor health, and on January the 1st, 1931, Grandma Hargrove died at the age of 64. A member of Papa's family came and told him that his mother was dead and told him where the funeral was to be held. Papa talked with Mama and told her not to say anything to Evie because she was very ill and not able to go to the funeral, and he didn't want her to worry. They both began to bathe and get dressed for the funeral. Evie sensed that something was wrong, and she came into the room where they were. She looked at them and said, "Ma is dead, isn't she? Myrtle, if you go to that funeral, I'm going too." Papa asked Mama to stay there with Evie, and he went to the funeral alone. Grandma was buried in the cemetery on Charity Lane west of Hazel Green. The grave is still unmarked until this day. Papa said that she was buried near a cedar tree, but we don't know where the grave is located. At this time, Papa had just lost everything that he had and didn't have money to help pay for the funeral. He talked to his oldest brother Ernest, Uncle Buddy, and asked him if he would pay his part, and Papa would pay him back when he was able. Ernest agreed and chipped in Papa's share along with his. Evie worried about her boys and would not allow them to go out with the rest of the family and work. She would make them sit on the floor close to her, and she would watch them all day long. Sometimes in the evening she would allow them to go outside and play with the Hargrove children after they returned from working in the fields or cutting wood. They were so happy when they got to go outside. It was as if they were wild animals out of a cage. Milton would cry and beg his mother to let him go and work with the family. Finally, one day she consented and let him go to the woods where they were cutting firewood, but she told Papa not to let him use an axe. When she became very sick and it was evident that she would die, she went to Florence's house to stay. On March 24th, 1931, she died at the age of 31, and Florence reared her two boys along with V's daughter as if they were her own. D. McClung had enough land to have more than one family share crop with him. One section of his land was rented out to a young man by the name of Jess Hargrove and his wife Fairy. Fairy had a half-sister by the name of Bitha Turner, who was living with them and working in the field with them for wages. Bitha would take the money that she made and buy nice clothes and jewelry. She had long black hair down on her shoulder, and when she wasn't working in the field, she cleaned up real good. Hassie had turned 16 on August of 1929, and he was at the stage of life to start to notice girls. But since Bitha lived practically next door, it was quite convenient for the two of them to get together to know each other. Pretty soon they were spending a lot of time together.